Hello Constant Readers, my name is Emily and welcome back to the Dark Tower Project. How do the themes of the Dark Tower series fit into American literature? Is the Dark Tower series American fantasy literature? So in order to ultimately answer the question whether or not the Dark Tower series is American fantasy literature, we need to talk about what exactly is American literature. How is American literature defined, and what are the major themes and preoccupations of American literature? Full disclosure, I am a Canadian, so this is an outsider's perspective of what American literature is. This is based on research, not really any experience in the genre. The study of American literature is offered at most universities. I was never particularly interested in American literature. This is how I have found American literature to be defined. Any literature produced in the USA or its colonies. So by that definition alone, the Dark Tower series is American literature because it was written in the land that we recognize as the USA. What I'm more interested in is what makes a piece of literature American other than just the place in which it was penned. Because American literature as a thing was an active effort in cultural production. Post-War of 1812, there was an effort to really establish a body of literature that spoke to American experience. Again, history is not my area. Quick summary, and I'm gonna look at my phone because I've got my script here. The War of 1812 lasted from 1812 to 1814. It was a military conflict between the United States and Great Britain. Canada was swept into the war because it was a colony of Great Britain. As a result, Canada was invaded a number of times by Americans. Basically, America decided they wanted Upper Canada because the Atlantic provinces were protected by British ships. Lower Canada had a big fort in Quebec to protect it, meaning that Upper Canada was easy to obtain. The war was fought in Upper Canada and Lower Canada on the Great Lakes and the Atlantic and in the USA. The Peace Treaty of Ghent ended the war, basically returned everything to as it was pre-war, and because nothing really changed post-war, my research indicates that this war could be considered a failure for the Americans. But because Americans had some pretty stellar victories, it proved that America was quite powerful. I guess it was like a self-realization moment for the Americans that they could come together as a nation. So even though the borders of America didn't change during the War of 1812, the perception of America changed during the War of 1812. What do we see in this literary and cultural production? So American lit depicts a forthcoming nation, because that's exactly what was happening. You see very much the idea of making something from nothing, which is problematic in itself because there was a something there beforehand, a whole indigenous population beforehand, but the settler colonialist narrative was of building something from nothing. So the literature was full of new and radical expectations. It was about America rivaling the rest of the world for respect and independence. The literature also had a tendency to be harsh, rash, detached, and insensitive. And so some common themes from American literature are the American dream, disillusionment, coming of age, justice and injustice, pursuit of happiness, war and peace, freedom and dignity, country versus city life, immigration, individual work ethic, feelings of alienation, transformation, and violence. All of these themes relate to colonialism and what it means to be a colonialist nation. Though nobody in my research used those terms specifically. I know that in Canadian scholarship, within the university, within academia, the language around colonialism is very much an attempt to be cognizant of the fact that Canada is a colonialist nation, that it is a settler nation, that the idea of building a Canada is false. Building something from nothing is false because there was a something here before. It's almost a deliberate erasure of a before if you try and start a Canadian nationalist narrative with white settlers. It bricks over everything that was here before. It's interesting as a Canadian researching this that the American texts around this, at least the accessible ones that I had access to for free, don't attempt to dig under that brick wall that was put up with the something from nothing narrative. It's just like, yes, America. It was a nothing and now it is a something. Just an observation. The American literature is very much focused on nation building, national identity. It's all about establishing independence from Britain, freedom, hope, the American dream of a fresh start, new possibilities, prosperity, and all of that American dreamness is juxtaposed with the harsh realities of living in America, which is, because of its size, very different in terms of climate and landscape, and settlers were moving into this really harsh environment. The reality is that life in the New World was built on violence. It was isolated, it was cruel. You think of things like the Donner Party, slavery and violence and genocide. That's all baked into American identity and to American cultural production and to the literature. I guess ultimately in American literature there's this push and pull between opposites. So we see harsh binaries. The thing that sticks out the most to me is like the hope and the freedom of the American dream juxtaposed with the slavery, the genocide, the violence that it takes to make the American dream. What is American fantasy literature? If you Google American fantasy literature, you actually don't get any results other than a list of American authors. I was hoping to find at least a small body of scholarship or research on specifically fantasy literature written by Americans. Given America's history as a colonialist nation, a nation whose involvement in the slave trade and use of slave labor still radically shapes America today, a nation of settlers, a preoccupation of the American dream. Like, the themes of American literature seem easily applicable to themes of fantasy literature. And I mean, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised that there wasn't a body of scholarship, given that fantasy literature is genre fiction and is hardly studied anyways. Like, it's only recently being studied in academic spaces. The scholars working in this area are few and far between, so I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was a little bit surprised because the whole, like, American ideology, you think that somebody in America would be studying the unique cultural productions that are American fantasy literature. Do I think that the Dark Tower series is like uniquely American fantasy literature, just in terms of its themes and preoccupations? I think yes. I think the Dark Tower series brings something uniquely American to a fantasy narrative, and it's not just because it's set in America. We see disillusionment tackled, which is another theme of American literature, right? We see Roland completely disillusioned with the conclusion to the Dark Tower series, that it's all a repeating narrative. He's done it all before. I would argue that we as readers maybe get to participate in that disillusionment, especially the first time you come to that conclusion and you're like, what the fuck? Like, if you didn't pick up on the Yeats references and the natures of the gyre and you don't know what Yeats's sort of bonkers philosophy is, maybe you were expecting some sort of epic fantasy conclusion to that. So I would imagine that for some readers there is some disillusionment with the ending. It's not this stereotypical fantasy ending, it is a harsh ending. We see Roland and his quartet struggling with issues of right and wrong, justice and injustice. And arguably we maybe even see the idea of immigration touched on with Susanna, Eddie, and Jake, who are pulled through the portal into another world, and they have to adjust to the space in which magic and sort of future sci-fi technology is a thing. They are immigrants in this new space. And then, of course, there's the theme of violence. There is so much violence. And of course, the gunslinger itself is a callback to Westerns, the American frontier, the time of the cowboys, and like simple times, but violent times. Like, I'm sure we can all picture what a Western looks like in our head. If you don't actively watch them, you've probably seen them parodied in some way. I think we very much see that with the gunslingers in the Dark Tower series. It's this callback to this fantasy of I guess the gunslingers are basically the equivalent of like the medieval knights. Something that was probably actually really shitty. To wear a giant metal suit and stab each other with pointy bits of metal. Probably not a great occupation. Same with cowboy. Probably not a great occupation, but we romanticize it in the same way. And so we get to see this violent, ugly life of the gunslinger. I think especially we see that in Wind Through the Keyhole, when Roland, as a young gunslinger, goes out with his pals and has to solve problems for a village being attacked by some monstrous creature. It's not an easy life. I think the Dark Tower series also touches on the explicit history of racial violence. Susanna has a brick dropped in her head as a child, and she is pushed on the tracks. And these are acts of violence. Done specifically because she is a black woman living in America, specifically because of the history of slavery and the racism that is built into American society. There are arguments now that slavery has just been shifted and it's still legal. Just look at the American prison system. Look at which bodies are incarcerated at the highest rates. Who is doing labor in prisons? It's black people. It's shifting the narrative around slavery, it's repackaging it, and it's calling it the justice system, right? And I'm not saying that Canada's any better, because the bodies in Canadian prisons are very much racialized too. And that is also a history of racism, slavery, colonialism, right? It's all baked in there. It's in the roots of our society in North America. And I think the Dark Tower series touches on that. Why does the Americanness of the Dark Tower series interest me? First of all, I think a lot of the fantasy canon comes from the UK. It's very European in structure. Fantasy spaces are often pseudo-medieval, pseudo-European history. And it's interesting to me that this Europeanness is often recreated by American fantasy authors. Look at George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire series. It is very much drawing on a European history. It's not just big texts, it's little ones too, like my favorite children's fantasy author, Tamora Pierce. Tortal is European. The whole setup of the Tortalan universe, it's pseudo-European medieval history. And both Martin and Pierce are American authors. Like they grew up in America. We do see new American authors imagining outside of the UK, so like outside of Western Euro influences. Children of Blood and Bone, Akata Witch, the Inheritance trilogy. Tomi Adeyemi, Nnedi Okorafor, and N.K. Jemisin are all new fantasy authors that are writing in America but imagining outside of Western European cultures, and that's super cool. But I find it hard to find genre works produced by Americans that have America clearly influencing their fantasy world. I mean, it's cool that a lot of these texts aren't Western and Eurocentric anymore, but there's so much going on in America, there's so much going on in terms of having a history of colonialism and racism that I think fantasy could tackle in really interesting ways and offer really interesting critique and commentary on, and like it doesn't seem like anyone's doing it. Briefly, I just want to go back to fairy tales for a minute. So the Grimm brothers' original folk and fairy tale collection, the first volume was published in 1812, and at that point it was a scholarly endeavor in cultural preservation. They wanted to uncover and preserve tales they thought were, quote, essential truths about the German cultural heritage, end quote, and that is from Zipes. In part, the collection was a protest against French occupation. They believed that modern literature was, quote, artificial and thus could not express the genuine essence of folk culture that emanated originally from the people's experiences and bound people together, end quote, also Zipes. The brothers felt it was their task to preserve the, quote, pure sources of modern German literature and to reveal the debt or connection of literature culture to the oral tradition, end quote. Fairy tale references therefore link the Dark Tower series to these pure and of the people type stories. Since the Dark Tower series is very much a about repeating narratives, literary histories, literary connections, and intertext, it seems only appropriate to me that it includes fairy tale references. And again, I want to come back to the cowboy. These fairy story elements link to the cowboy narrative in my mind. The cowboy is this idealized, romanticized figure in American history and American storytelling. So linking the Dark Tower series to the cowboy is perhaps a way to preserve and to critique the sentiments expressed in Westerns. And as we know, our cowboy Roland is part of a dying breed, so maybe in a way his inclusion in the text is similar to the Brothers Grimm. It's a preservation of some pure, slowly dying out piece of American storytelling. With the Dark Tower series positioned as American fantasy, that is a piece of fantasy literature that grapples with themes of American literature, I've decided to conclude this video by opening up a discussion about American fantasy literature. So the following humans are some of the big-name American fantasy writers. I'm hoping that by drawing on the more widely read American fantasy authors, that we will be able to have more discussion because more folks will have read these books. Ursula K. Le Guin, George R.R. Martin, H.P. Lovecraft, Brandon Sanderson, N.K. Jemisin, Robert Jordan, Terry Brooks, Robin Hobb, Jane Yolen, Kristen Cashore, Patrick Rothfuss, Tamora Pierce, and Lev Grossman. Those are like the really big names that stood out to me, that if you are in the fantasy space, you have probably heard of them. Let's think about the fantasy things that these folks have written, and let's discuss if there is anything distinctly American about their works. Do the themes commonly present in American literature cross over into these texts produced by American fantasy authors? Do we see these authors grappling with similar themes to the ones grappled with in the Dark Tower series? So that brings us to the end of today's video. Before we go, we have to thank my patrons. Thank you, patrons, for making videos like this possible. I really appreciate the work that you are enabling me to do. I really appreciate your support. If you are interested in becoming a patron, having early access to this content, the link to the Patreon page will be in the description box down below. So thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on American fantasy literature. This is a topic that really does interest me because of my immersion in the sort of academic space with fantasy literature and seeing what sorts of texts are being discussed. Shocker, it is mostly Tolkien. It's a lot of the big canon name authors that are British, and you'll notice that I didn't talk about those guys in this video because that's not really my interest. My interest is in the new things that are being produced in this genre. So let's discuss. I really look forward to talking with you guys, and until next time, long days and pleasant nights.